Now we've got the U.S. Senator from Wisconsin, Tammy Baldwin. Thanks so much for taking the time.
Oh, I'm delighted to join you.
Now, the fact that you're running for re-election in Wisconsin is a huge boon for Democrats. Can you talk about how you fared in the last election and what your margins were relative to other Democrats that were running statewide?
Well, I certainly can. Back in 2018, set of midterm elections, I was humbled to win with nearly 11 percentage or by 11 percentage point margin. A lot of Wisconsin races are decided by razor thin margins. And I want to just jettison ahead and say last week in Wisconsin, we saw another race that was won by an 11-point margin, and that was for our state Supreme Court. I think that there's probably some parallels to be drawn, but I do want to say that Wisconsin is a tough battleground state, especially in presidential years. It is not hyperbole to say that Wisconsin sometimes decides the outcome of presidential elections, and next year it could decide the presidential election as well as the balance of who controls the Senate.
And just to build on exactly that point, we saw Governor Tony Evers won by a 3-point margin, and we saw Republican Senator Ron Johnson win by a 1-point margin. So just to underscore the fact that Wisconsin is a true battleground state, and even though we did see wins like yours by 11 points and Judge Janet Protasiewicz by 11 points, which are huge margins and really do kind of buttress this idea that when we have good candidates who can win, that's a major boon for Democrats. It is still a purple state through and through. But with that said, do you know who you may be running against yet? Are there any grumblings from well-known Republicans?
I have probably a list of about a dozen people that I've been reading about in the last few weeks, either people speculating that they might run or they're offering their own names up and saying, we're seriously looking at the race. And they run the gamut between sitting members of Congress in this state to former party leaders to business leaders. There's a thing out there about how the Republican Party in the swing states, the battleground states that are up next year, are trying to recruit multimillionaires, even billionaires, so that they can self-finance and the Republican Party can put their money elsewhere to make more and more races competitive.
Yeah.
It's a sad state of affairs where you're just looking at billionaires and multimillionaires as your prospective candidates. That's why I'm so proud to be a fighter for the people and the working people of the state of Wisconsin. That's my focus. Frankly, the wealthy and the big corporations, they wield enough power already in Washington, D.C. We don't need to grow the ranks of their fans in the Senate or the House.
Now, what is your focus in the Senate?
Oh my goodness. Well, really, I want to carry on the progress that I've been making on the kitchen table issues that I hear about no matter where I'm traveling in the state of Wisconsin. A good paying job that supports the family, that lets you get ahead. And my Buy America, Made in America policies are bringing good paying union jobs back. I hear about the affordability of healthcare, and I want to continue my work on making sure that people on the Affordable Care Act marketplace plans can rely on assistance paying their premiums, work that I've been so proud of and we want to extend well into the future. We want to keep on lowering the price of prescription drugs like we just did with insulin for seniors and make that the way things are in America instead of paying 2, 3, 4 times more than any other industrialized country. And let me say resoundingly, Wisconsinites have told me, and they said at the polls last week, we want our rights and freedoms back. And that's a fight I've championed and continue to in Washington. I lead the measure, the Women's Health Protection Act, that would restore Roe as the law of the land, but take the extra step that's so important in a state like Wisconsin of making sure that states can't pass so many restrictions and limitations that right isn't, doesn't have any meaning anymore. And I want to remind folks that Wisconsin is a state right now, after the Supreme Court acted last summer, that has a criminal abortion ban. that was passed into law in 1849. And you heard me right, 1849, before the Civil War. That is what people in Wisconsin are living under right now. And we have to continue this fight until we've won, because it shouldn't matter what your zip code is or what state you reside in to know what sort of rights and freedoms you have.
Yeah, and I think, the fact that we have an 1849 ban in place, and that's what Republicans are fighting to keep in place, really
Yes.
does put on full display the aggressiveness of their agenda, the draconian nature of their agenda right now.
And they're not just doing it in the legislative bodies where we see bills in Congress to restrict abortion to 15 weeks nationwide and ban it. But you see judges now, Republican appointed judges, who are additionally trying to undercut, ignoring science, but just basically being a part of that extreme Republican bandwagon to try to take our rights away. Wisconsinites want their rights and freedoms back, not only on the abortion issue, but also with regard to access to the ballot box and having fair maps and getting our democracy back in order.
Yeah, and that's hopefully an issue that could be that should be bipartisan, regardless of where you are on the political spectrum. Just having a functioning democracy, so that all of those other issues can be litigated properly, can be decided properly. There will be Wisconsinites who are on the fence here. There are those Evers, Ron Johnson voters out there. What do you say to them to get their support ahead of 2024?
I've been working hard for Wisconsin, and I talked about the kitchen table issues that people, no matter where I am in Wisconsin, talk about. And I have a record of progress, but the job isn't done. And so, in terms of Wisconsin being a place that makes things, we make bicycles, motorcycles, vehicles, we make ships, we make beer, brats, and sausage and cheese. You know us for it because we do it really, really well. And yet we lost so many of those jobs. We've made great strides with my Buy America and Made in America policies in the infrastructure bill and in the Chips and Science Act to begin the process of reshoring those jobs, bringing them back to Wisconsin. Those are good paying union jobs that are going to help families get ahead. So, just one example of the work I've been doing that needs to be followed on. It's exciting to see progress, but we always know that we have more to do.
And I think just building on what you said about like the Made in America and Buy America, that's been like a Republican talking point for so long, and yet it's just been empty rhetoric. It took until there was a Democratic majority in the Senate to actually put those things into any legislation. And now that we have a Democratic majority in the Senate, now we're actually seeing those things play out beyond just, talking points and bumper sticker slogans. So I think that's something that's really important to keep going with here.
Yeah, and I see the difference it makes to Wisconsin companies. We saw a period of time where all sorts of foundries closed because if you have either a country where they're producing products with state subsidies, or a place that has no worker rights, worker safety laws, environmental laws, they can produce cheaper and they can dump their product in the US.
Yeah.
I've been fighting against those sort of dumping actions, but the Buy America really brings those jobs back and solidifies and secures those jobs for generations to come. I also want to say Wisconsin is a place that grows things and raises livestock. We are the dairy state. And so my advocacy on behalf of the dairy industry and farmers who have struggled mightily in recent years because of whether it's extreme weather events in Mother Nature or whether it's bad trade policies that have resulted in tariffs and lost export markets. I've been fighting back. And, you asked how I win back some of the folks that voted for Trump and voted for Ron Johnson. It's because I listen and deliver. And we're going to keep on working until there's a level playing field for all of our workers, whether they're agricultural workers or factory workers.
And I spoke with Judge Janet a few weeks back, and she also touted the dairy industry in Wisconsin, of which I'm an advocate in the stands as a spectator. I'm allergic to dairy, and like this whole like Wisconsin's like infatuation with dairy is like an actual death knell for me. So, what do you hope to see from the new liberal Wisconsin Supreme Court now that Judge Janet has won her race?
Well, the new court will be seated in August. And I feel fairly confident that there's a number of major issues that will come before the court. I already talked about the fact that we have in Wisconsin right now, the governing law about abortion is a criminal abortion statute that was passed in 1849. I expect that the next Wisconsin Supreme Court will hear a case on whether that's constitutionally valid under our state constitution 175 years later.
Yeah.
Right? We know a lot of things now that we didn't know back in 1849, aside from the fact that there were no women giving their input and testimony into the passage of that law back in that day. So I expect that they'll look at that case. We have horrid gerrymandering in the state of Wisconsin. We're one of the worst gerrymandered states in the nation. What that means is if you're in a particularly gerrymandered red state legislative district, you're a Democrat, a progressive, an independent, your likelihood of having your voice heard is so diminished. We have 1/3 of our legislature that are Democrats, and yet regularly we see these 50-50 turnouts, results in our statewide races.
And your race alone was an 11-point margin.
Right. You would have thought that there'd be some coattails if you didn't have such a gerrymandered state.
Yeah.
And so people deserve to have their vote registered and their voices heard. And then lastly, there's been a whole spate of laws restricting access to the ballot box passed over the past decade or so prior to this sitting governor. And I would add one more. There's been a lot of pullback on the right to organize in the workplace. And so those are the rights and freedoms that I talk about that Wisconsinites are desperate to regain.
Yeah, and your neighbor right there in Michigan just repealed their right to work laws for the first time in 58 years. That a right to work law has been repealed, and that's thanks to the fact that because they have fair maps and they were able to have their voices heard fairly. They had Democrats get full control of their government there, and so I think that's hopefully a harbinger of things to come in Wisconsin.
Yes.
Now,
yes.
Moving over to a different part of the country, we've watched as Tennessee Republicans pulled this crazy stunt to expel Democrats for protesting those Republicans' inaction on guns, only for that to then backfire as those two Democratic legislators got reappointed, and the whole country now has its eyes on Tennessee. Is there any sense among national Republicans that they're going too far and that this stuff is kind of backfiring on them? Or are they just too deep in it that they can't even, see outside their own bubbles?
Yeah, you know what I look to is who has spoken out, who has denounced the Tennessee legislature, who stood up and denounced January 6th, who stands up and denounces these types of actions that we see.
It's a short list.
Yeah, it is a short list. And, who's stood up and denounced the judge in Texas who issued a totally non-science-based decision. That's what I'm looking towards. And I see it's few and far between. But, I think every good progressive, every good Democrat, every good independent, and frankly, the righteous Republicans that remain should want a worthy adversary, if you will, in political discourse. I want to see those leaders reemerge. And frankly, you don't usually root for the other side, but boy, it's hard to have a two-party system with when you can't even agree on a set of facts and a set of challenges, and have a true discourse on how to solve the challenges that are agreed upon.
Yeah, I think that's well said. Well, going to the top of that party, we've watched as Trump has tried to incite violence against local prosecutors for for the crime of trying to hold him accountable for his crimes. What's your response to those thinly veiled threats and those warning shots that have been lobbed at Manhattan DA Alvin Bragg, for example, from Trump and Trump world more broadly?
Right. Well, this is certainly nothing new for our former president, to lob accusations, to bully, to demean. It's frightening from the perspective of we see it in authoritarian leaders who try to silence opposition, who use these sort of tactics to try to scare off those, in this case, just doing their job. But the bottom line is that nobody is above the law, whether you're a former president or the local grocery store clerk. Nobody is above the law, and he needs to be held accountable. And I believe in the rule of law and ability to get it done.
Yeah, and the fact that you believing in the rule of law is a controversial statement these days kind of does show the space we're in our politics right now. Going to the other side of the Republican Party, you have someone like Ron DeSantis, who back in his home state, I believe Fort Lauderdale is underwater as of this recording. Meanwhile, Ron DeSantis himself isn't there because he's on a book tour preempting his presidential run. Do you have a response to that?
Yeah, you show up. That's part of the job. I understand that one person can't be everywhere at once, but it is really, really important to listen, to be present, to understand the challenges that the people you seek to lead are experiencing, and so those are the things that I remembered, right? Who was there in the time of need? Who was there during the crisis? I think that's a really critical aspect of leadership that we're just not seeing there.
Yeah, I think that was perfectly put. And I think kind of underscores the fact that beyond all of the hysterical rhetoric about wokeness and critical race theory and all of these, Republican buzzwords just to try to get a 5-minute cable hit on Hannity, that there are people who are supposed to be represented there. And that's what's missing in all of this, desperation to raise his national profile and raise all of their national profiles while they're running for president. Senator Baldwin, how can we help your campaign?
Well, I'm going to have a very tough race. You invited me to start out by talking about how humbled I was to win by a sizable margin in my last race. Next year is a presidential cycle. You might have noticed that Wisconsin is a battleground state, and it is not hyperbole to say that we could decide the outcome of the next presidential election in Wisconsin. We could decide the balance of power in the United States Senate. They are recruiting the strongest possible candidate that they can find to run against me, maybe even somebody who can self-finance. And so people who want to be in on the ground floor to be founding members of this campaign can go to my website at www.tammybaldwin.com, not hard to remember, and give us a helping hand as we begin. This is something that we are not being funded by billionaires. We are being funded by small donors, by folks who want to do doors and want to make calls. That's how we win races, and that's how we're going to win this race.
Yeah, and I would just echo those same sentiments. I think if anybody watches or listens to my show, they understand the importance of Wisconsin almost above every other state. And we also know that Republicans will try their hardest to basically define you before you can define yourself. And so that's why it's so important to get out ahead early, to start raising money early, to start getting on the airwaves early and reaching all those voters who may not have been paying attention for these last few years, but who are paying attention now as we head into this next major election cycle. So with that said, Senator Baldwin, thank you so much for taking the time. Best of luck on the campaign trail, and appreciate you being here.
Thank you so much for having me.